as a father. And if my children start yelling hypocrite in the middle of this, then it's well deserved. I'm not here trying to tell you that I've done everything right and you should follow my example. But I have learned some things from my mistakes. And I hope that if I were to be a parent again, I'd be a better parent than I was the first time. I will tell you this, that if I'd known how great grandkids are, I would have skipped parenting altogether. There's no kids at all, just go straight to grandkids because they're great. Kids, pain in the butt. Grandkids are fantastic. And so if you have that option to just go right, no, I'm just kidding. I'm seriously kidding. I think children are wonderful. I know that there are some people who cannot have children. I'm not here to make anyone feel bad. I'm not here to judge anybody for whatever reason that is. There's a lot of reasons why a couple might not have children, and I'm not here to tell you that if you don't have children, somehow you're out of the will of God, or that's wrong. But I am telling you that if it's a choice not to have children, I think it's a poor choice, if it's a choice. And I think that all the fears that people have over having children are terribly unfounded. Especially the Malthusian ideology. Thomas Malthus was a British academic who basically came up with the idea that the world is going to become overpopulated, people are going to starve to death, and we need to limit how many children are born. Terrible. The science has been totally debunked of it, and as even like Elon Musk has been very has pointed out often, the actual problem in the world is not overpopulation, it's underpopulation. Underpopulation. The West is dying not because we can't feed enough people, but because we don't have enough people. And so the whole idea that somehow, you need to limit how many children you have, only have a couple, that you're not going to be able to afford them, all of that really is not true. It really isn't true. And so we're going to deal with more of that in the coming weeks as we go through this, but I just want to kind of set that kind of a tone of where I'm at. I'm not here to judge anyone for not having children or how you're raising your children. I'm not sitting in the back looking at you saying, if you only gave me your kids, I don't want your kids. I don't want to train your kids. I don't want to discipline your kids. I have enough trouble with my own children, or had enough trouble. Luckily, in part, all my children are gone. I don't have this issue anymore. They're not mine to train anymore. They're adults or whatever, and I don't train my grandchildren. It's not my job. And so I'm not here to raise your kids for you. I'm just trying to share a few things that I've learned and that I think Scripture teaches us. And I would like for you to take those, think about them critically. Don't just assume that what I'm saying is true. Read the Scriptures, study what it says, do your own research secularly aside, and reach your own conclusions. At the end of the day, they're your children and they're your responsibility, not mine. So I'm not here to tell you what to do. But I'm here to try to share a few things with you. So let's start today. I'm going to read a passage out of Psalms 127:3, one of the most famous texts in the Bible on children. I think it's a good place to start. It says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." Children are a heritage from the Lord. Now this word heritage, often gets translated in modern translations as a gift. They're a gift from God. And that's fine. It can be a little misleading, not because the translators are doing anything wrong. They're just trying to use words that are more recognizable, more understandable, and that's fine. The problem is in ourselves that we have a modern philosophy about gifts and inheritance that's at variance with the biblical use of those words, and I think even the real use of the word. So we think of inheritance and gift as like this windfall profit that happens to us that's just going to make our life better. It's very self-centered. Gifts are about us. Inheritance is like, we all dream that we have some billionaire uncle somewhere we didn't know about, but that he loves us somehow, and that when he dies, he's just going to leave us $1 billion, and it's just going to solve all our problems, and we're going to be so happy. And that's how we think of gifts and inheritance. That's not how they work in the Bible, for sure. Evidently in the Scriptures, that's not what inheritance is. It's not just this this no strings attached windfall that you come by. An inheritance is like being given a business. So in Scripture, in the Bible times and in the Bible literature, when somebody is given an inheritance, they are essentially given a business, a responsibility. So if you were the oldest child, you got a greater inheritance. And we think, well, that's just not fair. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One is to keep the inheritance, the land that's owned, all in one parcel, because if you inherit off land in little pieces to all your kids and them to all their kids, well, pretty soon everybody owns a teaspoon of dirt, right? And you can't raise a crop on a teaspoon of dirt. You can't feed a family, much less a whole tribe, which a tribe is just essentially all the extended families, right? We don't deal with that much anymore because we're all so individualistic. We all have our own little nuclear family that lives in our own little house, and we have our own little life. But back in those days, all the families stuck together, and that's what we call the tribes. These are large extended families, and that family owns the land, and that's why it's inherited mainly to the oldest son, not so that he's richer than the younger ones. That's not how the inheritance worked. He was essentially the CEO of the family. He kept the land together and made sure it produced enough crop, enough livestock, and other products in order to feed all this extended family. And so getting an inheritance was not, woo, let's go to Vegas time. Getting an inheritance was receiving a huge responsibility. A huge responsibility. That's how inheritances work. And they still work that way in today in a certain sense. If you were to have this rich uncle and he were to leave you shares in a company that made you majority shareholder owner, that wouldn't be for you to just go sell off the business, put all the employees out of work. You'd all of a sudden be thrust into a huge responsibility of trying to keep all these people that work in that business employed and keep the business solvent, because you have all this responsibility, fiscal responsibility on you. Still works that way today. It even works in the microcosm scale, right? It's why we like to give gifts, because we like to impose responsibility on the people receiving the gifts. It's why we don't like to give cash. We like to give them like a gift card, because we want to tell them where they're going to shop and what they're going to buy. No, you're not going to buy groceries. You're going to go to DFW and buy shoes, because that's all this is good for them. So we like to tell people, and we like to impose upon them this charge, this responsibility, that they're going to do what we think they ought to do. And when you receive that gift, you're saying, I'm going to do what you think I ought to do. And so it still works a lot like that today. Gifts still work that way. So when Psalms is saying that children are an inheritance, they are a heritage of the Lord, they're a gift, he doesn't mean they're like this thing to make your life fulfilled and happy and for you to feel like you're satisfied with your choices. It's all about you. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the children are an inheritance. They are the responsibility that God has given to mankind. So I want to just look at that for a little bit. Under that light today, talk a little bit about this. So what's happening in this thought that Psalms is having is that God is granting us and calling us into his eternal purpose of creation. And we do that through children. So God, when he created the world, he had an eternal purpose. He still does. His purpose is to project his glory from the spiritual or from the heavenly realm into the physical. And so God created a creation that is two parts. It's a physical part and there's a heavenly part. All right, it's what we call the heaven, what we call earth, and we call the universe. But we look at it and we see a physical world with physical laws, and then there is, according to the Bible, a spiritual world or a heavenly world, and it has heavenly laws. Paul says there are physical bodies and there are heavenly bodies. There's the two things. And he wants to put these two parts of creation completely integrated within themselves. And he wants from the heavenly realm to project his glory into the physical one. This is God's purpose in creation. This incredibly integrated heavenly physical existence. And in the middle of that, as the pivot point or the hinge of those two worlds, he puts mankind. Mankind is meant to be the temple by which that glory is transmitted into the world. The human. That's God's purpose. How does he accomplish this? Or how does he invite us into that? Well, without humans, there is none of that. So, for instance, I'll just read a text to you that says this very clearly. Hebrews chapter 2, he writes, "But one testified in a certain place, saying, You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and set him over the works of your hands." He's talking about man, the human. "You have put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all things in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him." That is how the Bible looks at us, human beings. God made this incredible heavenly, earthly creation. And over all of those things, he put mankind. And the commandment to man was to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. That's what God wants us to do. That is how this is the inheritance he's given us. This is the responsibility that he has put on us. A responsibility of stepping into that role of being that hinge, being that point at which heaven and earth come together and God's glory is projected into the earth. That is what God's role, and it's not just you as an individual, because that is very short-sighted and very short-term. So if you say, well, yes, me as an individual, I'm supposed to do that. That's true, but it's not all that's true, because how long are you going to live? 60, 70, 80, 90 years? Those of you who are young are probably going to live more than 100. But that's a very short amount of time. God's purpose of this creation goes on and on and on. And we're going to see next week when we talk about Revelation, that Revelation isn't the end of these things, it's just the start. God's plan is to reunify this heaven and earth creation that through sin has been fractured, and for mankind to take that place that he was always intended to have. And we do this according to the Scriptures. We continue this, we extend this, we fulfill this role that we have received through inheritance through our children as well, and them through their children. This is God's design for man. To procreate and produce more God image-bearing human beings, so that they can take the role of mankind that they fulfilled and teach their children to do it also. So we human beings are not primarily God's purpose. We are partners to God's purpose. See, we think, well, mankind, that God's purpose is man. Not exactly. Not exactly. God has a grander purpose, and our role is not to be the object of his purpose, but to be fellow workers with him in his purpose. Now, this is fantastic. From the gift mentality, we want to think we are just the object of God's purpose. We're the object of what God's trying to do. And what the Bible's telling us is, no, that makes you irresponsible. You just sit there and receive, and you're just looking for the gift. Where what the Bible's telling us is that we have received this inheritance. We now have a responsibility to, quote-unquote, till the ground, to make sure that the part that we've been placed over becomes productive and it fulfills God's purpose. So, for instance, I'll read you a few texts. 1 Corinthians 3:9, he says, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's fields. You are God's building." He's speaking of them, the apostles. He's saying, we are God's fellow workers. We're his fellow laborers. That's how the biblical authors thought of themselves. Not as being the recipients of God's grace merely, although we do receive his grace also. But they didn't think of themselves as just recipients of his grace, recipients of his gifts, but rather they saw themselves as contributing to. For instance, 2 Corinthians, again, in Corinthians he says, "Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as through God were pleading, as though God were pleading through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be ye reconciled to God. We are the ambassadors of Christ. We're not just receiving from God, we are the means by which God gives. It's very important to understand this is not just the apostles that were this way. This is mankind was designed to be this way. The whole point of the text I read you in Hebrews is that God designed man to be over all the works of his hands. But then Hebrews says, but when we look around, we don't see that that's what's happening. What's going on? The world is broken. Mankind is broken. We're not true humans, to put it that way, as some theologians say it. We're not true humans. Because the true human, the real man, the real human, is that person that fulfills the role that he was designed to do. It's like when I worked at Toyota a while back. We did some work there at Toyota, and we worked right in the little section where they make all the prototype cars. And they have this car that's made out of like solid aluminum or whatever it's made out of. It looks just like a car. But there's no motor in it. In fact, there's no space. It's just solid, so they can put metal on it and they can beat on it with a hammer and form it to whatever shapes they want and things. So it's just this hunk of steel, looks just like a car. But it does not do anything a car will do. No matter what it looks like, it will not do anything that a car will do. It's not a real car. See? And same way with little toy cars. Eldon has in my house a lot of these little toy cars. And they're made to scale. And they look just like a real car. But they are not a real car. There are a lot of creatures walking around the earth that look just like human beings. They look like them, they sound like them, they even smell like them. But they aren't. Why not? Because the human being is not defined by his shape or his color or his form, but by completing his design. Hebrews looks at man and says, man was made with a design. You have a purpose. And your purpose is this transcendent objective of projecting God's glory into the world. And if you're not doing that, you may walk and talk and sound like a human, but you're not a real, true human being. And that's why 1 Timothy, Paul says that there's one mediator between God and man, and it's the man, Christ Jesus. He is the man. He's the true human being. Because he's the first and only one so far to live up to every bit. He is the inheritor. He's the first one to receive the inheritance and truly live up to his design and do everything that a human being was intended to be. And that's why Hebrews says, we look around, this is what man is made for, we look around, we do not see that that's true, and yet here we see Jesus, crowned with glory and honor, the true man. So that's how the apostles are looking at what we, as Christians especially, should be. We should be striving to become the true human beings, the ones who are living up to their roles and their design that God has given them. And our design is not to sit there and just receive grace from God. We do receive grace from God. We should be thankful for that, but we receive it in order to give it, not only back to God, but to others. Our objective should be what Habakkuk says right after the famous statement that Paul quotes so many times, the just shall live by faith. That's Habakkuk chapter 2. Right after that he says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. What happens when the just live by faith? The whole earth will be covered with the glory of the Lord. That's what happens. And so, Christianity is the first religion that I can find record of that pursued conversion not by force. In fact, most religions didn't even pursue conversion at all. Pagans didn't believe in conversion. You didn't need to convert. You could be a pagan And you can believe in other gods. And when they've discovered new gods, they didn't convert from old gods to new gods. They just incorporated the new gods, and they just kept filling them in. That's why you have the pantheon with thousands of gods. Because you didn't need to convert as a pagan. And the religions that did have more of a monotheistic culture, like Islam today, and Islam historically, they didn't believe in conversion the way Christians did. They converted through death. You either converted or died. Christianity was the first religion that believed in conversion and believed that conversion was not through force, but through faith. Okay? I say that because this has often been misunderstood, this reality about Christianity and conversion, to the idea that Christians were all about bringing people into the faith through conversion. But that's not how Christianity actually grew exponentially in its first 300-400 years. Christianity grew because they believed that children were the responsibility of Christians, to have children and to raise those children as Christians. The Roman Empire suffered massive demographic decline. Massive. So much so that Rome went from being roughly 1 million people to a few hundred years later to being less than 100,000 people. And one of the main reasons for their demographic decline was because Roman citizens had quit having children. In fact, it was so dire, this birth decline, that Augustus, the first emperor, had passed laws trying to promote having children. Because Roman women and Roman men didn't want to have children. So this idea that, this is somehow very modern, that birth rates are declining around the world, and they are, even amongst Muslim nations, they're declining. This was not new. But the one group that was having children back then were the Christians. They were. Why were they having children? Their life was not better than the Romans. In fact, the evidence is that the more prosperous, the less trouble people have, the less money, the more money people have, the less children they have. People generally don't abstain from having children because they're poor, but because they're rich. Thomas Malthus's idea was that as food got scarce and money got scarce, then the population wouldn't be able to feed itself. What we find is that where there's more money, there's less children, not more. It's one of the reasons why his theories have been debunked. There's another thing that happened in Rome that made it where children were less desirable, and that was Romans had an idea that adoption was better than genetic children. It was better to adopt a child than to actually have your own child. And that's why when you read the Bible and you read about adoption, you need to put that in context. It's not the way we think of adoption. Adoption in the Roman world was very desirable. How desirable was it? The first 5 Roman emperors were all adopted. Augustus was not Julius Caesar's son. He was his adopted son. Romans considered it to be much better to adopt somebody worthy and put them in position of power than to put your own child in power who probably wouldn't be worthy. In fact, for the first 200 years of the Roman Empire, almost all the emperors were adopted. Almost all of them. There's very few exceptions. All the way down to Commodus. So if you've seen the movie Gladiator, which is not based on true events, but the characters in it are real. Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus, they were actually, and we saw in the movie the problem with children, right? The movie displays it. So Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, they're actually related. Almost all the other Roman emperors up to that point are not. They're adopted because they just didn't have a high view of children. They were looking to further the empire, and they wanted to have this meritocracy, and you went out and you found a worthy successor, you adopted them, and you put them in charge. You did not put your children in charge. Now, I would argue that it's because they were not following a biblical standard of how to raise their children, which is what we're going to be looking at. So, because of all this, we find just this, in biblical times especially, but I think this has continued even today, there's just this very low view of children. And I think this is a mistake. I think we should have a high view of children, a very high view of it. Having children is a good thing. I remember growing up, often I would hear Christians criticize people who had a lot of children. Like they need to get a TV, have something else to do. You know, they're going to eat bologna their whole life. I think this is a terrible mistake. I'm not saying you have to have 12 children. I'm not telling you how many children you should have. I'm just saying this view that somehow children are somehow a burden. They're somehow, something you just got to, they're just like this byproduct of sex, and you're stuck with them, so you have to feed them or you're going to go to jail. You have to clothe them and house them and whatever. And, every now and then they can be a little bit of fun, but they really are getting in the way of life. And I grew up with around people who believe that the goal of a parent is to get rid of their children. I think that's a terrible goal. I made a lot of mistakes as a parent, but one mistake I didn't make is I never wanted my kids to leave. Now, once they got married, that was their choice. Now they have to leave, right? We're not going to have two families and two dads in the house and for their own sake. But as long as they weren't married, stay as long as they want. I have no interest in them leaving. And I don't regret that to this day. Of all the things I regret, I don't regret having that sense. I grew up around the idea that as soon as you turn 18, you're out of here. Because I got things to do, and you're cramping my style. I think this is a terrible attitude towards children. That's nothing new. We think, well, that's the modern age. We've become very self-centered, very self-focused, and that's all true, and it's probably exacerbated. But I can find this going back as far back as I've looked. I find many cultures have this same attitude about children, that they're in the way. Why did Roman women want less children? Because they were in the way of the lifestyle they wanted to live. There's a great book on this called Roman Families. I have to look it up. Anyways, and they document actual through letters of mothers and fathers who are just trying to get rid of their children back in the 1st and 2nd centuries because they were in their way. Children should not be thought of as in the way. Children aren't something that happened while you're living. It is the reason you are living. Now, I'm not saying that anyone who doesn't have a child doesn't have a reason to live. I'm speaking in generalities and attitudes. There's something else about children as an inheritance that we need to talk about, and that is that children sanctify sex. They give it transcendent purpose. Sex in and by itself is inherently ephemeral, short-lived. It doesn't last very long. It's an intense burst of pleasure that lasts a very short amount of time, and therefore, in and of itself, it's pointless. It's pointless. And all the research bears out what I'm saying. Married people, in all the studies, have more sex than unmarried couples. Married couples have more sex than unmarried couples. Even though Hollywood is selling the idea that if you're married, you're too worn out and too bored to have sex together, and it's these unmarried people who are running around, they're having all the sex in the world. That just isn't true. It isn't true. In fact, not only do married couples have more sex than unmarried couples, they report much greater satisfaction than the sex that unmarried people are having. Completely destroys Hollywood narrative. And that's because sex without consequences isn't interesting. Just like anything without consequences isn't interesting. The reason we like to bungee jump or zip line or paraglide or any of the other extremely dangerous things that human beings love to do is because there's consequences. If it became so sure and so secure, and the statistics and the science told you that no one ever would possibly get hurt from it, we would lose interest. That's why the moment something becomes harmless, it becomes uninteresting. There has to be some meaning beyond. There has to be something beyond the activity that makes it interesting. We are creatures of purpose. It is not the pleasure in sex that makes sex interesting. It's the consequence. And the consequence is children. And that is a very serious consequence. Very serious. It's life-altering. Life-altering. It'll change your life forever. Now, if you approach children that they're in the way, and they are getting in the way of you doing the things you want to do in life, all your activities, your hobbies, your interests, and they're somehow in the way of that, well, then you're going to look at children as like a cancer, like a tumor, something that you need to get out of you as quickly as possible. If you look at children that they are the continuation of God's design, both for you and for the world around you, then you're going to look at children as being a great blessing and a tremendous gift, a tremendous inheritance, as God calling you into His eternal purpose, to collaborate with Him in a small way. And you're going to look at children very, very differently. There's most of you probably know him, the comedian, television personality Bill Maher. He recently said this. He said, speaking of the MAGA or the Trump Republicans, he says, their stated goal is that they want more babies. They're the baby party. And meanwhile, the Democrats, they're not having sex anymore, and this has been reported a lot. Now, this is true. I looked it up to see if he's, blowing smoke. No, it's true, right? The more liberal you are, the less sex you have compared to the more conservative you are. The less married you are, the less sex you have compared to the more married you are. And the conservatives are saying, we want to have children. Now, any demographer will tell you that it is just a matter of time before these liberals, their philosophies, put them into extinction. They're the dinosaurs if they keep up with this idea. Even Bill Maher, who is an avowed bachelor, refuses to have children, and that episode of his show put up a bunch of posters he made trying to encourage young liberals to have children. One of them I thought was really good. He had a poster that said, "Make more people who recycle." I thought that was really good. That encapsulates the idea of what children are biblically. Biblically, children are the things we make that propagate our values. Now, Maher would like for the liberals to do it. I think he's fighting a very uphill battle. Because he's going to have to come back to a point where he says, okay, children are the purpose of being a human being, or one of the main ones anyway. And so we're going to have to change our philosophy about children if that's going to happen. But he does, I think, in a very kind of back into the door sort of a way, encapsulate what the Bible's view of children is, and that is Christian parents should make more people who love Jesus. You may never win a soul to Christ, but you can have children and teach them to love Jesus. And that is actually what children, the whole point of children are, biblically speaking. So I'll end with just two passages. Ephesians 6:4, it says, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." This is how parents should be looking at children. We are training up those people who will love Jesus and who will reflect God's glory into the world. That's what children are about. That's the inheritance you've been given. That's the responsibility. As a human being, you have been given. Now, you don't have to have your own children necessarily for this. We also do this as a community and as a church. I know there are some people who, for whatever reason of their own, and I'm not judging anyone who doesn't or can't or won't or doesn't want to have children. I'm just saying that as a church and as individuals, we need to have an appreciation for children writ large. Not just our children. This should be a church that likes kids. There's a reason why we decided way back when we started, Mike and I, we are not going to tell the kids they can't run in church. We're going to tell the old people to come in pads and helmets. We're going to tell them to go stand somewhere out of the way. We want kids in church, and we want them to be kids. We want them to sit quiet for an hour during the service, and we want them to run like crazy afterwards. We should like kids here. We don't mind that your kids are here making a little noise in the meeting. I like it. It's fine. I deal with noise all the time. I work in construction. I can handle noise. We need to be a church that loves children and promotes children and promotes the value of them because of what they represent. They are the inheritance we've been given. They're the responsibility we've been given. They're the charge that we've been given. Not just our kids, all kids. All children. One more. Genesis 18:17, very famous passage on children. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." How do you think that was going to happen? All the nations of the earth will be blessed in Abraham. Well, because of his children. Because of his children. He says, "For I have known him," listen to this, "in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." He says, I know Abraham, and he is going to train up his children well. He is going to teach them to love me, and they are going to bless the whole earth. You and I will probably never have any impact on this world very much. But if you raise your children well, and they raise their children well, the impact that you will have on the world is incalculable. Incalculable. And that is not glory-seeking or self-centeredness. That is God's design. God wants you to have an incalculable effect on the world. He wants you to change the world. Because the world is broken. And it's not working right. Not just the physical realm. But it's severed right down the middle. And there is no connection for the majority of people between that which is heavenly and that which is physical. And how do we bring people to realize that God is going to reintegrate these? We do this through us living this. Through projecting that dual citizenship, if you will. We project that image to the world. We project that out. We show the world what it is to be a true human being. Not just successful, not just responsible on the physical side of things, job and work and all of those things, but also on the spiritual side. And we bring those together. And the best place to do that is in our children. So over the next weeks, every other week or so, as time allows, we're going to go through and talk about how the Bible teaches us to do this. How do we tend, how do we cultivate our inheritance, which are the children? Thank you. I guess I'm praying with Terry. Have you gotten a message from your mom yet about how your dad's doing?